The voice in your head lies to you every day. It whispers that you are your faults, your fears, your insecurities. But, as Carl Jung elucidated, this internal narrative isn't you. It's just the ego trying to maintain control. This incessant voice, which resonates in your mind, often presents itself as your true identity. However, Jung clarifies that this internal narrative is just a reflection of the ego, a psychic construct necessary for interaction with the external world. When this construction is confused with the true self, the perception of reality is limited, restricting the vastness of the human psyche. The most alarming thing is that most people live as prisoners of this mental noise, confusing its essence with an endless repetition of limiting beliefs. Meanwhile, the real you, the one that could guide your life with clarity and purpose, remains buried under layers of conditioning and external expectations. But what happens when you stop identifying with this voice? Something that few are prepared to face: freedom. A freedom that is not just the absence of external restrictions, but emancipation from the internal chains that the ego imposes. This incessant mental chatter dictates rules, judges past actions, and anticipates future scenarios, often with a negative bias. It works like a program running in the background, in which the ego clings to pre-established patterns and prevents the exploration of the collective unconscious. Jung describes the collective unconscious as a deep layer of the psyche, shared by all of humanity, which contains universal archetypes and common experiences. When the ego dominates consciousness, it blocks access to this rich source of wisdom and insight. The problem arises when this voice becomes the sole reference for identity. If someone fails at a project and the ego takes over, it whispers that the mistake defines the person, that incompetence is innate, and that further attempts are pointless. This limited perspective doesn't reflect reality. It's just a distorted projection of the ego. Jung teaches us that the human psyche is much broader than this superficial narrative. While the ego insists on a linear and predictable storyline, analytical psychology points to a more complex and dynamic spectrum of experiences and potentialities. Those who blindly believe in this inner voice become hostages to their limitation. The ego distorts experiences, reinforces self-destructive beliefs, and prevents true self-knowledge. In order to break this cycle, it is necessary to observe the mind chatter without identifying with it. An effective practice is to write down your own thoughts on a piece of paper and analyze them as if they were someone else's. This externalization technique gives you a perspective on your own experiences. This externalization technique allows for a more objective perspective, making it easier to identify negative patterns and deconstruct limiting beliefs. This creates a separation between the subconscious mind and the real identity, opening up space for individuation. Individuation, according to Jung, is the process of integrating all the fragmented parts of the psyche, leading to the development of a complete and authentic personality. However, this is only the beginning. Behind the incessant voice of the ego, there is something much vaster and more authentic: the self. Jung identified the self as the totality of the psyche, which goes beyond the limiting beliefs and repetitive narrative of the ego. The self represents the unification of the conscious and unconscious in a person, symbolizing the psyche as a whole. While the ego is busy cataloging experiences and classifying events as good or bad, the self remains a silent, deep core connected to the collective unconscious. It is not defined by momentary failures or successes, as its existence transcends the labels imposed by the subconscious mind. However, accessing this deeper level of identity requires a departure from the mental noise and a willingness to explore the depths of one's own psyche. Imagine an actor who has spent his whole life believing he is just the character he plays. If he never leaves the stage, he will never know who he really is. In the same way, those who identify only with the ego's narrative get stuck in repetitive patterns, believing them to be their insecurities, fears, and immediate desires. Jung invites us to go beyond this mental theater, recognizing that there is a part of the psyche that doesn't need external validation in order to exist. This journey towards the self is essential to achieving a full and authentic life. But how do you connect with this truest core? The practice of deep introspection is an effective way. This can be done through reflective writing, studying your own dreams, which carry messages from the collective unconscious, or even by analyzing recurring patterns in your life. Jung believed that dreams are a direct access route to the unconscious, offering valuable insights into neglected or repressed aspects of the psyche. The self manifests when there is enough inner silence to perceive it, allowing the true essence of the individual to emerge. Individuation only happens when you begin to differentiate between the subconscious mind and the real essence. To do this, you first have to face what has been repressed, the shadow. Jung describes the shadow as the set of repressed or denied aspects of the personality, those that the ego refuses to recognize. These are traits considered inadequate, shameful, or undesirable, which end up being projected onto the outside world. The shadow represents our most primitive impulses, our instinctive animal side, as a sum of our entire evolutionary past. Ignoring or suppressing the shadow can lead to internal revolt, while identifying and consciously integrating it is essential for psychic balance. When someone is deeply irritated by a characteristic of another person, they may just be seeing a reflection of their own shadow. This projection distorts the perception of reality and prevents true self-knowledge. For example, someone who constantly judges others as arrogant may be repressing their own need for self-affirmation. Someone who feels envious may be neglecting talents they refuse to develop. Instead of dealing with these issues internally, the ego displaces them outwards, creating unnecessary conflicts and resentments. Jung teaches us that integrating the shadow doesn't mean surrendering to it, but rather recognizing it and using it consciously. This process of integration is fundamental to the development of a balanced and authentic personality. Ignoring the shadow can lead to a superficial life, where the individual becomes overly concerned with the opinions of others, living as a walking persona. On the other hand, confronting and integrating the shadow allows for significant personal growth, leading to a greater understanding of oneself and others. An effective exercise for accessing this hidden part of the psyche is to observe patterns of frustration and irritation. Whenever an intense emotion arises, it's worth asking, what does this reveal about me? This simple reflection can be a portal to the unconscious. Often, the emotions we reject or minimize say more about us than we are willing to admit. Another powerful technique is automatic, uncensored writing, allowing the shadow to express itself without filters. This method helps to identify repressed thoughts and patterns of behavior that operate in the subconscious without our being aware of them. When we allow these thoughts to flow onto paper, we become observers of the mind, rather than mere passive participants in its drama. Integrating this rejected side of the personality is a fundamental step in the individuation process. Jung emphasized that only when the shadow is illuminated can the true self emerge. This process, however, is not easy, as it directly confronts the ego's illusion. The ego prefers to keep the shadow hidden for fear of losing control over the inner narrative. However, the more the shadow is ignored, the more it manifests itself destructively, whether in self-sabotaging behaviors, unexpected emotional outbursts, or recurring patterns of failure and frustration. Carl Jung described individuation as the most essential process of psychic development. Different from simply adapting to social norms, individuation means integrating all the fragmented parts of the psyche, including those that the ego would prefer to keep in the dark. It's a call to authenticity, to the freedom to be who you really are, without the need for external approval or fear of rejection. However, this path is not comfortable. It requires the courage to look inwards and question everything that has been accepted as absolute truth. It means confronting one's own insecurities, recognizing where the ego has acted as a tyrant and allowing repressed aspects to be integrated into consciousness. Someone who has always seen themselves as a peaceful person may discover hidden aggressive traits. Someone who thought they were independent may perceive a deep need for approval. These uncomfortable encounters are necessary because it is only in accepting these polarities that the psyche finds balance. Jung believed that psychic balance can only be achieved when there is a sincere recognition of internal contradictions. If we deny the existence of certain impulses, they continue to act in the shadows, influencing our decisions in an unconscious way. A practical way to start this process is through critical self-observation. Instead of just reacting emotionally to events, ask yourself, is this response coming from my ego or from a deeper place? This simple distinction can completely transform the way we deal with challenges and frustration. Practices such as dream analysis, which Jung considered a direct portal to the collective unconscious, are also valuable tools. Dreams often reveal symbols and patterns that reflect our psyche on a deeper level. Ignoring dreams means missing out on essential information about who we are and the inner challenges we are facing. Individuation doesn't happen overnight. It's an ongoing process, but each step taken in this direction dissolves a little more of the illusions created by the ego. And when this happens, even the mental quagmire takes on a new meaning. Most people see mental chatter as an enemy, an incessant noise that drains energy and generates anxiety. But Jung teaches us that instead of trying to silence it by force, it's smarter to listen to it strategically. These recurring thoughts don't appear by chance. They are reflections of unconscious processes that need to be understood. If someone keeps beating themselves up about a past mistake, this may indicate a need for internal reconciliation and not just a random annoyance. What many people do is fight this voice, trying to suppress it or ignore it, but this only strengthens its hold. A mistake made years ago can become an unbearable weight simply because the ego refuses to integrate the experience as learning. Jung emphasized that the unconscious always finds ways to manifest itself. If we don't listen to its messages directly, it will manifest itself through repetitive patterns, psychosomatic illnesses, or interpersonal conflicts. Instead of running away, a more effective method is to write down these thoughts and ask, what do they want to teach me? If the mind keeps repeating a fear or guilt, it doesn't mean that the person is weak or insecure, just that there is something waiting to be processed. This practice of questioning transforms the way we interact with our mind. Instead of being a battlefield, the mind becomes a space for exploration and learning. Jung argued that individuation depends on this capacity for conscious internal dialogue. What today seems like a torment can actually become a map for personal development. If the mind insists on remembering a failure, perhaps it's time to review the lessons it brought. If there is constant self-criticism, it could be a sign that the ego has created unattainable standards of perfection. Seeing the mental quagmire as a messenger rather than a villain transforms its role in the psyche. Instead of an obstacle, it becomes a powerful tool for self-awareness. But for this transformation to take place, a strategic detachment from the ego is necessary. The root of much of human suffering lies in blind identification with the ego. Carl Jung emphasized that the ego is only a part of the psyche, not its totality. However, many people live attached to this limited identity, believing that they are their thoughts, their momentary emotions, and their conditioned fears. This attachment creates an illusion of control, but in reality, it strengthens internal barriers that prevent deeper contact with one's essence. The more someone clings to the ego, the more they become hostage to its traps. The ego constantly seeks to reinforce the illusion of separation and control by creating narratives of superiority or victimization. An effective way to break this cycle is to develop the ability to observe your own thoughts as if they were someone else's. This detachment allows you to see the mental flow. This detachment allows you to see the mental flow without being dragged along by it. Imagine that your mind is a radio station, broadcasting nonstop. You can cling to every word or simply listen curiously without reacting. This observation exercise creates a separation between consciousness and the mental stream, allowing the psyche to function more clearly. Practices such as meditation, mindfulness, and introspection help in this process, making it easier to see the difference between the ego and the true self. The point is not to eliminate the ego because it has its functional role, but to establish a balanced relationship with it. When the ego stops being a tyrant and becomes just a tool for navigating the external world, life becomes lighter. And this lightness comes from understanding that thoughts don't define who you are. They are just a temporary reflection of the mind, like clouds passing through the sky. And so the journey of individuation continues step by step towards a deeper and more authentic state of consciousness. The most common mistake is to believe that the mind needs to be in complete silence in order to reach this state of consciousness. But in fact, the aim is not to stop thoughts, as that would be impossible, but to not be dominated by them. The mind is naturally active, producing ideas, memories, and projections all the time. The problem arises when we identify completely with this incessant flow, believing that we are just this sequence of automatic thoughts. By recording recurring thoughts on paper, it becomes easier to perceive their patterns and question their validity. Jung suggested that this type of practice helps to unmask illusions that the ego insists on perpetuating. Over time, this distancing allows access to deeper levels of the psyche, where concepts such as the collective unconscious and archetypes begin to reveal themselves. The collective unconscious, according to Jung, is a shared layer of the human mind, full of universal symbols and patterns that influence our perception of the world. It is at this point that the connection with greater forces of the mind becomes possible. When we stop fighting thoughts and start observing them with curiosity, we begin to realize that reality is not as linear as the ego would have us believe. Jung introduced the concept of synchronicity to explain events that, although apparently causally unconnected, carry deep meaning for those who experience them. These significant coincidences are not mere randomness, but manifestations of the collective unconscious. If someone finds exactly the information they need at the right moment, or crosses paths with a person who transforms their trajectory, this is not just luck. It's a reflection of symbolic patterns that operate beyond rational logic. Most people ignore these signs because the ego insists on seeing reality in a fragmented way, separating the subject from the external world. But the psyche doesn't work like that. The unconscious is constantly interacting with the environment, projecting internal contents and shaping experiences in ways that go beyond what the conscious mind can comprehend. If someone begins to notice recurring symbols in their life, such as a specific animal appearing repeatedly or a number that comes up at key moments, it can be an invitation to explore deeper aspects of one's own psyche. These synchronicities act as messages from the unconscious for those who are willing to listen to them. Keeping a diary of unexpected events and their possible internal connections is a practical way of noticing these manifestations. Jung argued that these occurrences are not mere accidents, but reflections of wider psychic processes. The problem is that in modern society, the excess of external stimuli and fast-paced life make it difficult to perceive these subtle signals. The ego, obsessed with control and predictability, ignores the mysterious aspects of existence and dismisses them as irrelevant. However, those who learn to recognize and interpret these messages access a deeper dimension of reality, where life seems to be guided by a greater intelligence. The psyche sends clues all the time, but a state of presence is needed to grasp their true meaning. And when you learn to recognize these patterns, the mental quagmire begins to lose strength because the mind no longer needs to fill the void with noise. Most people live trapped in thoughts that aren't really theirs. From an early age, beliefs, patterns of behavior, and even fears are absorbed from the environment without any questioning. Carl Jung warned of this danger. If the subconscious mind is not examined, it will continue to repeat inherited ideas, like a broken record. The problem is not just mental noise, but a lack of discernment about what really makes sense to the individual. Breaking away from this programming requires a more critical look at one's own internal narrative. A powerful exercise is to question each recurring thought. Does this idea come from me? Or was it imposed by someone else? Many of the limiting beliefs that govern someone's life may have been absorbed in childhood or reinforced by past experiences. An individual may grow up believing that they are not good enough for a certain job, not because it is true, but because they have internalized criticism from others. By challenging these assumptions, you begin to dissolve the ego's filters and see your psyche more clearly. Conscious reflection doesn't mean eliminating thought, but observing it without being sucked into it. Practices such as writing down an uncensored stream of thought or reviewing critical internal dialogues can reveal patterns that have gone unnoticed. Analytical psychology teaches that this separation between observer and subconscious mind is essential for personal development. And as this awareness expands, it becomes possible to access something even more powerful: the archetypes that shape the psyche. Archetypes are universal patterns of behavior and thought that emerge from the collective unconscious. Jung identified several archetypes, such as the sage, the hero, the shadow, and the puer aeternus, the eternal youth, which influence the way we act and perceive the world. When we blindly identify with certain archetypes, we can lose ourselves in limiting roles. For example, someone who sees themselves only as the hero may feel a constant need to save others, sacrificing their own journey. Knowing that the mindset doesn't define who you are changes everything. But understanding this in theory is not enough. You have to apply this knowledge. The separation of the ego, the integration of the shadow, the conscious use of archetypes, and the perception of synchronicity are not just abstract concepts. They are tools that can transform the way you think and act. What you do with them now determines whether you remain hostage to your own mind or finally take control. Most people go through life without questioning their internal narratives, without realizing that they are repeating patterns imposed by others. You have the chance to break this cycle, but it requires action. Observe your thoughts, challenge your beliefs, study Jung, analyze your dreams, write down your reflections. The ego will resist, but every time you weaken your identification with it, a more real part of you emerges. And the stronger this part becomes, the more you connect with your true essence, the one that doesn't need external validation to exist. If this content made sense to you and helped you see your mind in a new way, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. This not only strengthens this work, but also ensures that more people have access to reflections like this. And if you want to support this channel in any way, any contribution is welcome. Your help allows more content like this to reach more people and continue to be produced. The journey of self-knowledge is profound, and each step taken can transform lives. So let's expand this quest together.